Today's episode of Beyond the Mask is presented by the insurance specialists at Bright Think Wealth Strategies. Find the disability insurance coverage that fits you best right now. Email Robert Smith at rsmithjr@financialguide.com. The show is also made possible by the team at CRNA Financial Planning. Get a free consultation today to be guided through the complexities of investing and financial planning. Just visit crnafinancialplanning.com. And don't forget, listening to our podcast can earn you Class B credits. For more information on how you can submit them, check out the CE Credit tab on our website, beyondthemaskpodcast.com. Welcome to Beyond the Mask, innovation and opportunities for CRNAs and advanced practice nurses, with certified financial planner Jeremy Stanley and CRNA Sharon Pierce. Jeremy Stanley has worked with CRNAs for more than 23 years, and Sharon Pierce is a former president of the AANA and the NCANA. Join us as we leave the operating room and learn the latest in the CRNA and advanced practice nurse industries. Beyond the Mask starts in 10, 9, 8,
7. Sharon, you ready to do this?
I'm ready. Are you ready, Jeremy?
I'm always ready. Even when I don't have to be. Right?
Well, you ought to be ready. Where are we at, Jeremy?
We're in Wilmington, North Carolina, at the North Carolina Association of Nurse Anesthetists meeting.
Well, I'm glad you're oriented now.
Back together again, right?
I know.
Yeah.
That's good.
So, yeah. And we have two of our favorites with us today.
Absolutely.
Nancy Bruton-Maree and Sandy Ouellette. Welcome.
It's good to be here.
It is.
Glad we're here this weekend instead of last weekend with the big hurricane headed our way last weekend.
We wouldn't have had the meeting last weekend, would
right.
we?
Well, there's no damage here, but
No.
that probably made us evacuate just for safety.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Yeah, but it's nice. It's good to see so many old friends and meet new ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the fun part about these meetings.
Yeah.
And we're coming up on the PAC event tonight. And
Yeah.
North Carolina knows how to do that right.
That's right.
Yeah,
It's
they're
gonna be
always
a fun time.
Mhm.
Yeah. So we're going to be building on our historical series today. And Sandy, why don't you tell us who we're going to be talking about today?
Oh, we're going to be talking about Elizabeth Lank, and they called her Betty. And as you'll see as we move through this, she really established the foundation for what has become the Boston Children's Hospital. And she was just like a one-man show for years and years and years. But a very interesting person, lived to be 97 years old.
Wow. The vapors were good
That's
to her.
right. I think maybe we shouldn't be evacuating all those inhaled vapors because all those ladies live forever.
Yes, they did. Yes,
maybe
they did.
Maybe it was good for you, and we didn't understand
and
it.
doing
at the time.
children and all those
Yeah.
inhalation
Yeah.
inductions, they really
Yeah.
got the vapors.
Well, who wants to tell us about the early life of Betty?
I'll tell you about Betty Lank's early life. She was born January 4th, 1904, and she lived in Campobello Island, which was off the coast of New Brunswick in Canada. So she was not born in the United States. Campobello Island became famous later on because it became the summer home of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And it was there on that island that he contracted polio. Also, an interesting fact was that Betty's uncle taught Franklin to sail a boat when he was young. Betty was the first of 9 children. Now, I don't think I want to be the first of 9 children, although I probably would get my clothes first.
Yeah,
And then
that'd be better than being the
Then
ninth.
they'd be handed down.
Well,
yeah,
or
so
the eighth.
I would get new clothes. Yeah, okay. So maybe it wouldn't be so bad to be one of 9. But she began to become passionate about becoming a nurse at the end of World War War I. And Sandy will talk about World War II. And again, but by the end of the Second War, she really, really wanted to be not just a nurse, but she wanted to be a nurse anesthetist. And at that time, she was only 14 years old.
Huh. Wow.
So
Very interesting, too, that she's Canadian. And, the founder of AANA, Agatha Hodgins, was also
That's
Canadian.
right.
And they lived so close to the American border. And they both gave us a whole lot of gifts that we still enjoy today. So, and still they don't have nurse anesthetists to any extent in
And-
Yeah.
Canada after all these years.
Well, that's
Yeah.
why they had to come here.
That's right.
So-
That is
I
correct.
was going to
So-
say we've had a few infiltrate the U.S. now, haven't
Well,
we?
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Sandy, tell us about her nursing and her anesthesia education.
Well, she really became very passionate about a career in nursing at the end of World War One, and so she came to Boston in 1923 and entered the School of Nursing at what was then the Newton Hospital at the age of 19. And remember, in 1923, these were all on-the-job training nursing diploma programs. And remember that Agatha Hodgins also came to the Boston area years ago to further her education. And so as she was becoming that nurse that she thought she wanted to be, she was given an option to pursue public health or anesthesia. And she immediately thought anesthesia starts with an A. It looks a whole lot better than public health. So she became...
Now, why do we know why those were the two options?
No,
or-
I really don't know.
Interesting.
But they were the things that she was encouraged to do. But after she graduated from nursing, she worked as a private duty nurse in the Boston area for a short time. And then she returned to Newton, that same hospital, for a 3-month, now remember, 3-month postgraduate course in anesthesia. And when she finished that 3 months, she was considered a nurse anesthetist.
3 months.
3 months.
Wow.
Yes. And so this was, around the time of the Depression, and jobs were very scarce. And she could only find work as a relief nurse in New York City. So she was there for a while, and then she returned to Boston to work as a relief nurse at Boston Children's Hospital. And so in December 1935, she was hired full-time as an anesthetist at Boston Children's Hospital. And that was after her 3-month training, see one, do one, teach one type anesthesia. And from the time she entered the Boston Children's Hospital, she continued her career there until her retirement in 1969. So her relief job lasted over 3 decades,
Wow.
over 34 years. And interestingly enough, when she retired was the same year that I began my career in anesthesia. And I'll be giving a presentation in Orlando the first of next month, and it's professional gifts and personal responsibilities. And it's gifts from people like Agatha Hodgins and Betty Lank and many others that paved the way and made it easier for us to expand our wings and fly compared to what they had to start with 3 months of education and no equipment and almost no drugs or anything.
Wow.
But anyway, she came and she settled in there, and she really laid that foundation for Children's Hospital.
That's great. Well, Nancy, why don't you tell us a little bit about her life as an anesthetist at Boston Children's Hospital and what that was like?
Well, Betty was first acknowledged as the anesthetist for the hospital in 1936, as Sandy said. And soon after that, she became the chief nurse anesthetist, and she held that job for quite a few years. Well, actually for a long, long time. At the time that she became chief nurse anesthetist, the department consisted of 5 nurse anesthetists, 1 gas machine, which they shared throughout the hospital. And these same providers provided anesthesia at Boston Children's Hospital until after World War II. So they were it for quite a while. Lank was sent to Yale Hospital for a week in 1939, and that was to study cyclopropane, which up until then was only given to adults. It was not given to children. So when she returned to Boston's Children's, Lank had a small mask and a container suitable for a child constructed. And as we go on, you will see that she played an integral part in development of a lot of anesthetic equipment for pediatric patients. She used the mask and the container to administer cyclopropane. And the first time she used it at Boston's Children, it was for a tracheoesophageal surgery. And this began the monumental push for the use of cyclopropane as an anesthetic for children. So she basically introduced the use of cyclo in pediatric anesthesia. Before 1945, the anesthesia division was officially supervised by what was called the surgeon-in-chief. Now, as I mentioned, there was one anesthesia machine in the facility, and most of the anesthetics, therefore, had to be delivered by drop technique, because there's no way all 5 of those nurse anesthetists were going to be using the same machine. So equipment for pediatrics usually consisted of either a large or small Yankauer mask, one simple gas machine, or what was called a Richardson bottle. And the underside of the mask, sometimes it was padded with gauze, and sometimes they pinned cloth on it, I guess with safety pins.
You know, I have Miss Bunn's ether masks, and I took the gauze off. It still had the gauze on it whenever she gave it to me. It was almost like stockinette that she had on it, but I figured it was pretty disgusting.
And
since
back
she used
then,
it in the 60s. So
back then they didn't really have any pediatric masks, any pediatric equipment, and so that's why they took the gauze and sort of
made it
fit these little kids, because all they had is adult stuff. They didn't have much of that.
Yeah.
But they were made of metal.
Miss
And
Bunn's
so
are.
by using the gauze or the whatever padding they used, you could make it fit the child. By the more you put on, you would put more on for a small child versus an older child. One of the things that they used, though, was one thing that I only heard about when I was in anesthesia school, and when I heard about it, I knew I might get out of nurse anesthesia school if I had to start using it. But it was for sedation, and it was tribromomethanol, which was called Averton. And you gave it as a retention enema. That's why I would have
to
left
children.
Yes.
To children.
Yes.
Oh my.
Primarily children.
Oh.
And you either used it alone or you combined it with morphine or nitrous oxide or ether, depending on how much. It was really designed for sedation, but you could certainly
I guess
do
you knew
more
they
with
were
it.
asleep whenever they lost their enema contents. Was that how that worked?
Well, it was very light, like a sunlight light, sensitive, and it only had a shelf life of 2 weeks. So you had to either use it in a hurry or throw it away.
Use it or lose it.
That's right. But that was another thing that was used at that time. Endotracheal tubes were not commonly used, just volatile anesthetic, and the primary volatile obviously was ether. And, of course, the things that you were using, like your cyclopropane and your ether, were explosive. So it was a dangerous career at that point in time and there were OR fires and that sort of thing that went on.
Well, that's the reason why OR doors,
Go out.
most doors are so that you you push out, because if there's a fire and people are getting trampled, the doors are supposed to be pushed out. But that's not the way OR doors are.
So
you have to open them.
Oh, really?
Because if you had an explosion,
you don't want the door to open.
You don't want the door to open. That kept only the people in the room were supposed to die.
That's
not
right.
everybody else, just the people who were in that room.
Well, that's nice.
And that's
of them,
the
wasn't
reason
it?
why
It's
the
still
plugs,
that way. They still do them that way.
Really?
That's the reason why the plugs in operating rooms are up
5 feet
high, because the gases would
The
fall
gas would go low.
and they were flammable.
Except cyclo, and it's stratified everywhere.
Huh.
No, I'm sorry, ethylene. It's stratified everywhere.
Wow.
I was talking to
All the monitors had to be 5 feet up too. That's how they started putting them on top of gas machines.
Mm-hmm.
And now they keep them there because it's convenient, but there really was a reason to put them there.
Wow.
I was talking to one of our graduates today, Judy, who graduated in 1965, which was a few years ahead of me. And when she first went to her first job in rural North Carolina, they were still dropping ether then in the mid-'60s. And
So
I remember as a student, a couple cases I did with ether because it was required to be able to sit for your certification exam. And then the other thing was cyclopropane. I used cyclopropane, which was a very interesting drug, but I always was just real nervous about the explosion risk of it. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, Betty was remembered for her mask anesthesia, and she did it in the supine, prone, and sitting position. So anesthetists in this time had to really be experts in airway skills. They really did. That was vital.
Mm-hmm.
But she remembered one craniotomy that she did the anesthesia for in a child with a difficult airway, and she sat under the drapes holding a mask during the entire procedure. And she said a lot of mucus was dripping all over her, and at one point in time in the anesthesia, the child vomited while she was trying to maintain a tight mask fit.
And she's breathing in a lot of that gas too.
So anyway, you're sitting under the child, oh my gosh. The only monitors at that time were stethoscopes and blood pressure cuffs, and the skill of responding to barely perceptible changes in heart tones. It was critical for safe anesthesia at that time. The other thing about Betty was often she would recover her children, and it was said that she would often sing to them when they were emerging. She evidently had a very soft voice and a very good singing voice, and she would sing lullabies to them when they were waking up. But she was known as a kind and gentle person, and like I said, she would sing to her patients, but she remembered how frightened her little patients were because parents could only visit on the weekends. And so she had a lot of compassion for them. She also required a lot of nicknames. She was called by some Bessie, some Bess, and some Bet, and some Betty.
So she'd answer to pretty much anything.
Anything, yeah.
As a CRNA, you spend years preparing yourself for this career, so we don't want to see you lose out on any of the income you've worked so hard to earn. The best way to protect yourself and give you the confidence that a major life event won't disrupt your financial future is through disability insurance. We've known disability income specialist Robert Smith for many years and have seen the work he's done with nearly 2,000 CRNAs over multiple decades. He can help identify any gaps in your existing coverage and fill those gaps by finding the best value on a policy. Contact Robert and let him know you heard about him on our podcast. Send him an email at rsmithjr@financialguide.com. That's rsmithjr@financialguide.com. Or call him at 504-394-6557. Protect your greatest asset as a CRNA, yourself and your ability to earn a living by adding disability insurance to your financial plan.
So, Sandy, what was her role in advancing pediatric anesthesia?
Before we go there, I remember, now Betty was in the 30s, 40s, and so on, 50s. But when I started anesthesia and graduated in the 1970s and did a lot of cardiac anesthesia, we didn't have monitors for those real small infants either. And all we had was a blood pressure and a precordial or esophageal stethoscope. And then we had Dopplers that we could use. But, at that time, the trained ear could tell so much about those changes in heart signs, whether they're strong, whether they're getting weaker, in terms of more anesthesia, less anesthesia. And we would always keep the little baby's hand bent toward us. And you put your finger, in their little fist. And, if they were getting tight, you squeeze and, and all of that. And so, like Nancy said, it was a true art. It would be very hard for people to do any of that today, I think, because we have everything that we don't have to, but it's probably much safer. But they really had to be on the mark in terms of vigilance. Well, we do too.
Sure.
But monitoring and everything.
Well, you had fewer aids, I guess you could say.
That's right.
The other thing that I remember, too, we were talking about her sitting under the drapes. Before I went to anesthesia
being drooled
school,
on.
but when I was working in the OR, prone cases in the neuro room, there was a little chair with no legs on it.
Telling me
that the CRNA sat under the patient that was prone in that chair the entire time they were giving anesthesia in prone cases like laminectomies and that sort of thing. And I also remember, too, that when they would bring little newborns down that had like myeloma meningoceles and they needed to close them, They would put a nasogastric tube in and put them to sleep with whiskey.
Yep. Just do some of that.
Wow.
Okay, so what was her role in advancing pediatric anesthesia? Well, for 34 years, Miss Lank devoted her professional life to delivery and advancement of pediatric anesthesia at that institution. And following her education with cyclopropane at Yale, as Nancy said, she returned home and demonstrated the first use of that in infants because people thought it could not be done. But she, like so many others that we've talked about before, like Alice McGall and Agatha Hodgins, she not only did this, but she went on to publish her work in articles, and one was Cyclopropane Anesthesia, a series of 150 cases, which was probably remarkable in that day because people didn't think it could be used in pediatrics. She used low-flow techniques and well-fitting masks to minimize any leakage around it, and the use of cyclopropane for infants undergoing tetralogy of Fallot was proved feasible by her because nobody thought that should be the anesthetic of choice at Children's Hospital. But as I've said in some of these other podcasts, I can understand why it worked probably good for these kids because cyclopropane was like an inhaled ketamine. Mm-hmm. It sort of supported systemic vascular resistance and the sympathetic nervous system and everything. And so if you've got a child with a TET, one of the things is a ventricular septal defect. And they desaturate when they get more right to left shunt. And so what you do is you increase systemic vascular resistance. If a child is running around playing and that happens, they squat. That increases systemic vascular resistance and their oxygenation improves. Well, you can't do that in OR, so you increase it. And that cyclo did that. And I don't know if they knew that was one of the reasons it was working so well, but it probably stopped the TET spells or certainly reduced them at that point. So she did that. And the other thing I found very interesting, she administered a successful anesthetic using a mask. Now just think about this. While Dr. Robert Gross divided the first patent ductus arteriosus in 1938. And so this event marked the beginning of pediatric cardiac surgery and anesthesia. And she was the anesthetist of record for that first division of a patent ductus arteriosus.
And this is a spontaneously breathing
open chest
child.
Open chest.
Open chest.
Holy cow.
But later, she was asked to do the same procedure on a 200-pound adolescent for a person that had lived this long with a PDA. And she had a difficult airway. Again, Sharon, open chest in the lateral position with a 200-pounder.
With the spontaneous airway.
And she also, in 1939, administered anesthesia for the first successful esophageal atresia repair for a surgeon named William Ladd.
You have to remember, Sharon, there was no gas machine.
Well, they had one.
Well, I know, but you don't know that she was using it. And
Right.
These masks weren't made for ventilating.
Right.
So
they had
Wow.
to spontaneously breathe. Wow.
Well, records show
That's-
that the child was always in the forefront, and she administered anesthesia for more than 16,000 surgeries herself at Boston Children's Hospital. And so among the surgeries, she assisted with that of a Prince Alexander, who was son of Princess Lilian and King Leopold of Belgium. And she was involved in that case in September 17th, 1957. And she continued a relationship with Princess Lilian throughout her life. She was an innovator in equipment because she started off and they had no equipment. So I can see her always thinking, how could this be better? What do we need? And she worked with engineers at the hospital to develop a variety of sizes of masks. and blood pressure cuffs, and everything you'd need for an infant all the way up to adolescence. She also helped design with the Forger Company to develop small rebreathing bags, because they didn't have those to begin with. And if you look at her contributions beyond the operating room, she participated in the design and creation of the first recovery room at Boston Children's Hospital, because when she started, that's why she stayed with them and helped them
They
emerge.
didn't have a recovery
They didn't
room.
have a recovery room. Now, Robert Smith, and when Nancy and I grew up as students in anesthesia, he was known as the father of pediatric anesthesia. And he had a book, Anesthesia for Infants and Children, and that was the Bible. It was the only one back then. But he was brought to Boston in 1946 to chair that department. And that book is now in its 7th edition, and I often wondered how much of that book that Betty wrote. I imagine it was quite a lot of it. But he was the father of pediatric anesthesia, and she didn't leave. She stayed right there, and she worked with him for 20 years and demonstrated the heritage of nurse anesthetists and physician anesthesiologists working cooperatively, or I like the word collaboratively, for the benefit of patients in the field of anesthesiology. She's noted for taking extreme measures in caring for patients pre and post surgery when they didn't have PACU or recovery room. And she, as Nancy said, she would hum and sing to the children and just soothe them. Well respected by anesthesiologists and surgeons at Boston Children's Hospital. And in an article by on pediatric anesthesia, Dr. Smith called her, and I quote, an enterprising nurse anesthetist when he described the development of child-specific materials for anesthesia, because prior to that, they had none. And then the chief of surgery at Boston Children's Hospital, his name was Dr. Harvey Hendren, in a publication referred to Lank as superb and cited her historic contribution as the anesthetist's own record for the first patent ductless repair. And, so now we've got Betty Lank doing that. We had Olive Berger doing the blue baby operations. Mm-hmm. And again, if you look at most history books that are written by physicians, you'll never find these names.
Isn't
and that's why we have to tell our story.
Yeah, exactly.
That we have to keep telling it.
Well, it's just like that, the guy with the blue babies, the black guy that...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Thomas.
Thomas.
Yeah, his last name was Thomas. Lab technician.
Yeah, that's right.
If he had not worked with all those dogs, and many of them died until he figured out how to do it, Blaylock would have never been able, and Blaylock wouldn't even go into the operation without him when they first started doing it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow.
The unsung heroes or hidden figures. I love that
hidden
movie.
Figures. I like that.
Today's show is brought to you by the folks at CRNA Financial Planning, an independent consulting firm that offers financial planning services exclusively to CRNAs and their families. From planning for a child's future college expenses to building a predictable income stream in retirement, the firm is committed to offering you comprehensive financial services, customized to fit your unique needs and objectives. If you have questions about your financial future, get them answered. Call the team at 855-304-3748. That's 855-304-3748. Or go online to crnafinancialplanning.com.
So, Nancy, was there any involvement in ANA level by Betty?
Yes, she was one of the early members of the AANA. It was called, of course, as you know, NANA then. She was a trustee, which at that time there were trustees which were replaced by regional directors in the future part of AANA. But she was a trustee from 1949 to 1951. But she was more instrumental in Massachusetts than she was on the national level. But because she was very instrumental in organizing the first meeting of the Massachusetts Anesthesia Nurse Nurse Anesthetist Association, and they met in the Ether Dome in May of 1940. And she also served as a secretary-treasurer and also as the president of MANA. She served as secretary-treasurer also of the New England Assembly of Nurse Anesthetists, which I think is still in existence, isn't it?
It is.
Where all the New England states
They still have meetings.
Yeah. And she was named Woman of the Year by the New England Assembly of Nurse Anesthetists.
Now, did either of you ever meet her?
I did not, but I'm glad you asked that, Sharon, because I was telling my husband, Dick, who most people know is also a CRNA, from Massachusetts area. He was from the North Shore, grew up in Salem, Massachusetts, which is right outside of Boston.
The place where the witches.
witches.
Yeah.
That's where he was born. And but anyway, he said as a young anesthetist, he met Betty Lank. And he met her because his program director was a student of Betty Lank. So Betty Lank had taught the person anesthesia that became Dick's program director. And Dick said, and I had no idea when I met her or for years later who this woman actually was.
Wow.
And what she did. The first anesthetic for the first patent ductus, the cyclopropane for tetralogy of Fallot, esophageal. He said, I had no idea who this woman was, right in his state, who had done all of that.
Wow. Isn't that interesting? Do we know much about her private life at all? Did she marry or
She did not marry.
Do not know.
I would suspect not if she was putting them to sleep and recovering them.
Well, and if you look back, like Agatha Hodges and Betty Lank and Gertrude Fife and Helen Lamb was the only one that came through married a lot.
And she married better each and every time.
That's right.
Leave it to an
so
anesthetist
she
when
did,
you
but,
do it well.
But most of them, well, many of them did not marry. I mean, their life, I just see that Tom Brady, and he and his wife are filing for divorce, I guess, because
he won't quit playing football.
Yeah, because he's married to football. Well, these women were married to anesthesia.
Yeah.
They couldn't have done all the things they did and had much of a life outside it, really.
That's true.
And so it's really remarkable.
But Sandy, at that time, you probably had to be. I mean, if you were a woman out in the workforce and accomplishing the things these women were, you had to be married to that. You couldn't have a husband who expected you to take care of the children and cook
and make his food
and do the things that were accepted at that time.
Well, look back at Alice McGaw, the mother of anesthesia, and she married a surgeon, and he thought her job was to come back with him and raise his children.
Right.
Well, the children, 2 of them of the 4, didn't like her too much to begin with, and that wasn't her thing. And so they never divorced, remember, and she ended up going back to Mayo, but never regained her notoriety that she had prior to this. But you're absolutely right. It had to be all or nothing.
Yeah.
Well, Helen Voss even told our class one time that in the time that she decided to be a nurse and then a nurse anesthetist, she said you couldn't be married and have a career at that time.
Exactly.
She said it was not possible. So you had to make a choice. Yeah. Did you want to be a woman who had a career or a woman who had a family?
Well, I went to Watts Hospital School of Nursing. It was a diploma program. And you could not be married and be in that program. And that was in the late 60s. I graduated from that program in 66, I think it was. And you could not get married. You were in your senior year, and if they found out you were married, you were discharged from the program.
Wow.
And there were some of my classmates and others before and after me that they did get married, but they kept it a secret. I mean, how could you not get married? We were surrounded by Duke and State and Carolina.
Oh, those cute guys. Holy cow.
But anyway, can you imagine that? Now you're telling a student they can't get married while you're in this program?
Well, when I was in nursing school, you could not get married until you were a senior.
We couldn't get married at all.
I got called into the office when I married Pierce.
But, it was generally accepted that women got married a lot younger, but the problem is the career piece. That's where the issue came in. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Sandy, let's talk about her laying place and her death at this point.
Okay, she went back home to New Brunswick, Campobello Island. I bet I've never been there, but I bet it's just gorgeous.
Yeah.
And of course, Agatha Hodgins died at Chatham, Massachusetts, but they all had that same view of the water. And something that I really love. But she died on March 10th, 2001, at age 97. In 2002, a plaque was dedicated in her memory in the Department of Anesthesiology, Perioperative and Pain Management in Boston Children's, which she helped establish. Well, she laid the foundation for all of it, actually. And on the plaque was inscribed the words, "A kind and gentle anesthetist." In her memory, they closed with remarks that it's hoped that future anesthetists would be inspired to emulate the wonderful qualities of this kind and gentle anesthetist. And I will say, in my short view of Boston Children's Hospital, that has carried on. Our grandson, who's now 23 years of age, was born with a transposition of the great vessels. And they lived in Virginia at the time. But they checked around, and the best place to go was Boston Children's Hospital at the time. So he had all of the repair work done there.
Wow.
You can look at him today. He's a picture of health. He had the Fontan procedure, and he's doing really quite well. And most of all that work was done before he was 18 months, 24 months of age. And, when I was doing pediatric cardiac back in the 70s, we couldn't operate on them until they were a certain size, because they didn't have the equipment and everything. And so that's why they had many palliative procedures for these children. But he's done really quite well, and we're proud of him. And so it's carried on the tradition. Now, there was an article published in the ANA Journal about her, and I would like to say at this point that a lot of this information came from that article. And it was done by two CRNAs, Stacy Galvin and Janet Dewan. Janet Dewan, I've come to know more recently, does incredible work in anesthesia in third world countries, and supports a lot of people going to meetings and everything. She's just a wonderful person, and she's still up in that area. And also on that article was a Mark Rockhoff. He's a physician, I assume, an anesthesiologist from the Boston area, the Harvard system, and all of that. But it is a very good article, and you can find more information there, and that's where most of this came from. And I want to give them credit for that great article that they published on Betty Lank. Because like Sharon, you said you'd never heard of her, and there's just not a lot about her. And it should definitely be captured for what she did.
Absolutely. Well, to wrap up, do you guys have any closing thoughts about Betty?
Well, one thing that Betty said, and it's a quote from her, is be diligent and please do not be impersonal. That was her message to people that she taught. With pediatrics.
Well, that would go along with the kind and gentle part, wouldn't it?
It would.
And Sandy mentioned Dr. Markoff. One of the other things that he said about her was, it was hoped future clinicians would be inspired to emulate the wonderful qualities of the kind and gentle anesthetist.
Oh, very good. Very well said.
She was obviously known for her caring personality.
And lived a long life, 97 years old.
My heavens.
As long as you've got your health, that's okay, right?
Yeah.
When you don't, then so. Sandy, Nancy, thank you guys as always.
Always
a
be
pleasure.
Here.
And good to be together.
Yeah.
Here in Wilmington at the North Carolina meeting.
And
can't wait for the party tonight.
That's right.
Party.
Pack party.
And they are working on something that's going to be awesome. We're just going to drop some chum in the water right now. We got some good stuff coming up from these two.
Yep.
You just wait.
As always, they're always thinking, always a wealth of knowledge and information and better things to come, right, Sandy?
Yes, and Watchful Care too. I don't know exactly when, but probably next year, maybe the first of the year.
Yeah.
They will have the from 1990 to right now published, and it's going to be a very interesting book. It's done, I think, in 3 sections. And so Watchful Care 1 has 7 chapters, and this will be 3 sections in Watchful Care 2 that covers the period up until today.
Huh.
So that's going to be exciting, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Looking forward to
All
it.
right. Sharon, I think it's a wrap.
I think so.
We want to thank our listeners for listening to Beyond the Mask with Jeremy Stanley and
Sharon Pierce.
You almost forgot, didn't you? Jeez. If they like our show, Sharon, and they want to help us out, what can they do to help us?
The best way to help us is to leave us a review, but make it
Positive. As we all know, there's way too much negativity in this world.
absolutely. Tell all your friends about us. Share us on social media because we're in the top 50 medical podcasts in the country on our way to
Number 1, just like we are in the CRNA community. And as always, we appreciate our listeners helping us out.
We sure do.
We couldn't do this without the listeners and the smart CRNAs out there like Sandy and Nancy, who bring this wealth of knowledge to us and bring these topics to us about the historical series. And if there are other CRNAs who have topics or things that you think is important, please let us know. We'd love to have wonderful CRNAs doing good work on the show.
That's how we find a lot of these topics. People let us
absolutely.
know.
Yeah.
And we appreciate that.
Yep. Till next time.
It's a wrap.
Have you thought about what would happen if you weren't able to work for 2 or 3 years? On average, 25% of people will file a disability claim, and most of us aren't prepared for that loss of income. Every CRNA needs to protect their biggest asset, yourself, and your ability to earn with a disability insurance policy. We recommend contacting Robert Smith, a master disability insurance specialist with more than 30 years of experience and 1,800 CRNA clients, to find the coverage that fits you best. The best way to do that is to send him an email at rsmithjr@financialguide.com. That's rsmithjr@financialguide.com. Or call him at 504-394-6557. Beyond the Mask is made possible by the team at CRNA Financial Planning. With almost 2 decades of experience, the firm guides CRNAs through the complexities of investing and financial planning. Schedule a free consultation today by calling 855-304-3748 or go online to crnafinancialplanning.com.
Hi, this is Jackie Rolls, President of the International Federation of Nurse Anesthetists and President and founder of Our Hearts, Your Hands, a global anesthesia support community that takes donations to allow nurse anesthetists in low and middle income countries to go to educational programs, to buy equipment or textbooks. Your donations are tax deductible, and we would appreciate your support.
Be sure to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and anywhere you like to listen to shows. Also be sure to check out BeyondTheMaskPodcast.com. Each episode is posted there with a corresponding blog post, and we timestamp important parts of the episode to help you quickly get to the content you're looking for. Also check out the special series section on the site. You can follow along and catch up on the CRNA History Series, episodes specifically about political conversations in the industry, or try the CRNA Personal Finance Series. It's all on BeyondTheMaskPodcast.com. And if you have a question for the show or want to be a guest, or even suggest a particular topic, fill out the contact form on the site or send an email directly to us at info@BeyondTheMaskPodcast.com. And lastly, let's take the conversation social. Check out our Beyond the Mask podcast Facebook page and Facebook group.